Hey, and thanks for tuning in. I'm your host Holly and you're watching Travel Insights. Today's edition of Travel Insights is covering dark tourism. But first, let's see what's going on in the travel sphere. Well, today marks the lifting of the ban on leaving Australia without an exemption. Fully vaccinated Aussies and permanent residents can now travel overseas without this exemption, and there will also be reduced quarantine requirements for fully vaccinated travellers when they return to enter the country. Although you must show evidence that you have been vaccinated at least 7 days prior to international travel in or out of Australia. And plus, you've got to provide evidence of a negative COVID-19 PCR test taken within 3 days of your flight's scheduled departure to your airline when you check in for a flight to travel into the country. And children under 12 years of age can travel overseas without an exemption. These rules also apply to the people who hold a temporary visa and were vaccinated overseas, including Australian students, residents, tourists, and other international students. People who show proof that they cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons, for example, can also travel without an exemption. Vaccines currently approved in Australia include AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen-Cilag as well. The TGA also recognises the following vaccines not registered in the country, including AstraZeneca, Covishield, and Sinovac Coronavac. The first quarantine-free flights into Australia have landed this morning, with a flight from Singapore landing in Sydney at 5:30 a.m. this morning, and a Qantas flight from LA in the US following half an hour later. For those who are not fully vaxxed yet or have a vaccine not approved by the TGA, arrivals into Australia are capped at 210 each week and are taken at one of 2 quarantine hotels still in operation. There are 16 flights scheduled to touch down in Sydney today, and Australia's borders have been closed for a total of 590 days. That's a whopping almost 2 years. Safe to say the end of this travel ban could not have come soon enough. And it's time now for a short break, but stick around because we're diving into the disturbing world of dark tourism. Welcome back to Travel Insights on Kalkine TV. We know that the hit Netflix show Dark Tourist has catapulted the travel phenomenon to the mainstream, but you might be surprised to learn of the latest craze in the space. And craze is right, or better yet, craziness, because dark tourists have set their eyes on the COVID epicenter, that is Wuhan in China. Now I know what you're thinking, there's no way the Chinese government is going to let waves of curious foreign tourists go digging around the wet markets, when various international intelligence agencies and the WHO themselves haven't been given the same freedoms. But apart from the covert nature of the virus's origins, this brazen venture begs the question, how soon is too soon when it comes to dark tourism? Well, to help us unpack all this, today we're fortunate enough to be joined by the person who coined the term dark tourism in '96, Professor John Lennon, the Dean of the Glasgow School for Business and Society at GCU. First of all, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on Travel Insights, Professor Lennon. And now we know that obviously dark tourism has come under the spotlight recently, thanks to obviously the hit Netflix show. So what are your thoughts on this recent mainstream success?
So the phenomena certainly has gained press and filmic coverage. You're absolutely right. But it's an old phenomena, the fascination we have as humans with death, with evil, with the dark side of human nature. All of those historical elements of our past, genocide, war, assassination, incarceration, all of those things have been, if you like, part of our history. But we also have older records that show people observing battles, people selling battlefield sites. So the phenomena has existed for some time, people viewing hangings in London in the 15th century. But I suppose what's important is that it's often considered in terms of its educational value, a modernistic conception of tourism, that you learn from understanding and visiting these sites and you become better and improved. But I think what we're on the cusp of now is the revolution in communications technology, the transparency of everything, the visualization of everything. So the collapse of space and time through media means that, how shall I say, these elements of our history, of our past, of the recent past, are suddenly available to everyone, from horrific videos we can get hold of online to images, iconic images of dark sites throughout the world. And I think that's why you see people like Netflix picking this up, because they know there is an audience there and they know there is a watching public. And we know that, how shall I say, that what people view and what they read also reflects these dark interests. Crime is the most popular form of fiction, and the darker crimes, the serial killers, the detail of the evil perpetrated is particularly enjoyed both in literary and filmic and TV formats. We know this. So this stuff sells. So you shouldn't be surprised that Netflix has a hit. But I think for me, it's also a little bit about human behavior and human motivation. Tourism and where people travel to is no different from their other desires, emotions, and choices. It's an aspect of human behavior and activity. Looking at this stuff, reading about it, and then visiting these sites seems to be the behavior we have recognized for some years now.
Well, I suppose it's a natural next step to visit the places we hear about. And obviously the psychological aspect is fascinating as well. Now, you might have heard about the buzz of the COVID epicenter becoming the new dark tourism hotspot. What issues do you see with this, first of all?
Coming to Wuhan, and particularly the alleged source of COVID, there is obviously clear sensitivity about this in the Chinese government. And it's sensitivity in terms of perceived blame and perceived responsibility, and nobody wants to be at the epicenter of that. And of course, what we have to look at here is already there seems to have been a recorded interest of visitors to the wet food market in Wuhan who are going there to see it. And now there seems to be issues about accessing that site and certainly photographing or filming there. And that is coming out of, perceptions of blame, accountability, responsibility, and a naturally secretive state who, let's be clear, are quite keen to cover many parts of their current operation and practice in other parts of the country. But yeah, I don't see any let up in this. I think our fascination with death, with evil, with this kind of pandemic location associated with, global event like that is not going to go away. Like the interest in crime fiction, in series about genocide on Netflix aren't going to diminish over time. It's part of us as humans. It's stuff we are fascinated by, and hopefully we will learn from. And I think those sites will continue. I remember being asked after the World Trade Center catastrophe, the 9/11 one, would this become a tourist site? I was asked that in 2002. And of course I said, yeah, unaccountably it will. It will be impossible for you to visit Manhattan and not go past that site. Tour buses will traverse this area. And of course, some years later, a museum to commemorate that past goes into place. But there's also a memorial, which you can look at too. And it has become part of the gaze, the tourist itinerary, if you're in that part of the world. It doesn't change, but maybe it helps us better understand tragedy. And for those who weren't around when that occurred, or have only got a vague detail of it, that museum site will provide a lot of quite strong, factual, and well-interpreted materials on it.
Right, I definitely agree there. Do you think as well that perhaps the passing of time influences our ideas of what's acceptable and what's not? I guess to phrase it differently, is there such a thing as too soon when it comes to dark tourism?
Yeah, that's interesting. So when I started working on this, seems a long time ago, I talked about a phrase, chronological distance within living memory, as being quite important. So, for example, the Second World War would have resonance for me because my father might have been part of it. So it has a reality. But the First World War appears quite distant, and most of those combatants involved in the First World War now are passing away. So there is limited living memory. So, and we also have seen that when something is too raw, there is almost a backlash against commemoration or exploitation. So, for example, Jack the Ripper in London, it's quite acceptable to do a Jack the Ripper tour. But if it was a more recent serial killer murdering people, it would be deemed as bad taste or unacceptable to do that within days of the individual going on trial. That doesn't stop people doing it, of course. We have lots of records of people independently going to crime sites, going to sites of incarceration, stopping at places where planes have crashed and deaths have occurred. So the human interest continues. My opinion on what constitutes acceptable over time is largely immaterial, because the information is liberated now. The data is available on the internet and other forms. You can find out what's happened when, and in many parts of the world, you can visit such sites. We have that freedom in many parts of the world, and we have wealth in order to move. So whilst I hear what you're saying, and I did think that was an important factor, the living memory thing, I do think that has probably shortened now, and I don't think it's easy really for anybody to say what is acceptable. Jack the Ripper's victims were human as well. They had lives, they had relatives and families. Their death and their passing was as tragic, if somewhat longer in the past. Yeah,
I completely agree. And it's interesting as well how we as humans deal with these issues. So perhaps it really is up to the traveler to decide when or if Wuhan is truly a safe and sensible bet for their dark tourism bucket list. With that said though, thanks very much for joining us on Travel Insights. It's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts. Welcome back to Travel Insights. Wuhan aside, let's count down our top picks for dark tourism sites in 2021. Coming in at number 5 is the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii, Italy. This one is a real classic, so much so that it might not be considered dark tourism until you remember what it actually is. Pompeii was a thriving coastal city in Italy that was completely destroyed in 79 AD when the neighboring Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered the city in ash. As archaeologists began excavating the site, they discovered the tragedy of bodies upon bodies. The ash preserved their shape perfectly, and since they were decomposed, they filled out the hollowed area with plaster, creating human casts that we see on the site today. Many historians say that Pompeii is one of the key places that paints an accurate picture of daily life during the Roman Empire. It depicts their living conditions, diet, and social life all frozen in time. Because the city is exposed, it'll be too warm to visit during summer, which is why it's better to visit during the cooler season as well as in the early morning to avoid the crowds. Number 4 is the Killing Fields and S21 in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. This Southeast Asian tourist hotspot is about as dark as it gets. Cambodia is home to the killing fields that saw the execution, starvation, and disease kill off between 1.7 and 3 million people. Prior to Vietnam invading in 1979, the Khmer Rouge and their brutal regime created many sites of mass killing around the country. Today, these sites exist to educate and inform visitors about the dark history of Cambodia. Phnom Penh, the capital city, holds the most well-known mass-killing sites, an infamous political prison known as S21. Although this destination is not an easy one to visit, it's important to keep history intact and memorialize all those who suffered through this dark period. Number 3 on our list is North Korea. There's little doubt that this isolated country strikes fear into many, particularly tourists. One wrong move and they can lock you up and throw away the key. Perhaps the most unusual thing about the DPRK is that you're not allowed to travel by yourself, and you instead must join one of their carefully curated propaganda tours. This place is known as what's called a cult of personality tourism. Apart from this, North Korea is difficult to get to and often pricey, but it still remains a favorite among dark tourists. Number 2 on our list is Fukushima in Japan. The nuclear hotspot is home to the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. The reactor meltdown and explosions at the plant in the wake of the 3/11 earthquake and tsunami became known as the triple disaster. The region has only recently opened up to tourists, hoping to bring light to a destination marked by tragedy. You might remember Fukushima from the hit series Dark Tourist. Well, it turns out the Japanese government wasn't too happy about the portrayal of nuclear disaster sites as severely contaminated, even though that might be the biggest draw for dark tourists to begin with. And number 1 on our list is an attraction that's still in the works, but promises one hell of an underwater experience. Tours of the Titanic Wreckage. This site is set to become a dark tourist attraction for wealthy fanatics who will pay to see the ship for a price of nearly $200,000. As it stands, the wreckage of the RMS Titanic is sitting on the bottom of the ocean and deteriorating rapidly thanks to sea currents and bacteria eating away at the iron. This means that time is of the essence if tourists want to explore it in all its glory. On board the expedition are archaeologists and marine biologists to accompany the 40 or so people who paid to see the iconic ghost ship. But it'll be no easy journey. Along with 1,500 tragic victims, the Titanic is resting 600 kilometers deep off the southeast coast of Newfoundland. How's that for dark tourism? Let us know in the comments what your favorite destination is, and join us next time on Travel Insights exclusively on Kalkine TV.